For years, Brianna Lewis perfected the art of appearing fine while hiding the reality of her abusive marriage to Richard, a charming investment banker with a dark side. When her father asked a simple question at her 31st birthday party, "He treats you well, right?" something inside Brianna finally broke. In a moment of raw courage, she revealed her bruises, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter her life. With the support of her parents, her friend Sarah, and victims advocate Elena Vasquez, Brianna left Richard and began the challenging process of rebuilding her life. She secured a temporary restraining order and filed for divorce, taking her first tentative steps toward freedom. But the path to recovery is rarely straightforward, and Brianna's journey is just beginning. As she prepares for her court hearing to make the restraining order permanent, she will face not only Richard's manipulations, but also a shocking revelation that will reframe everything she thought she understood about her marriage. What follows is not just a legal battle, but a profound reckoning with truth, healing, and the power of breaking silence. Join us for the next 3 chapters of this powerful story as Brianna discovers the full extent of Richard's deception, reclaims her identity, and ultimately finds a way to transform her pain into purpose. If this story has resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel to follow Brianna's complete journey. Chapter 4. The Courtroom. The Suffolk County Courthouse stood like a fortress against the winter sky, its granite facade weathered by decades of Boston winters and human dramas. Brianna sat on a bench in the hallway outside Courtroom C, hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. Her mother sat beside her, occasionally touching her daughter's shoulder in silent reassurance. Her father paced nearby, speaking in hushed tones with Brianna's attorney, Diane Mercer, a former colleague known for her razor-sharp mind and unwavering composure. "He's here," Sarah whispered, sliding onto the bench on Brianna's other side. "Just came in through the side entrance with his lawyer." Brianna's heartbeat accelerated. Even knowing Richard was in the same building sent a familiar wave of anxiety through her body, a physiological response conditioned by years of walking on eggshells, of anticipating his moods, of bracing for the storm that inevitably followed his calm. "Remember what Elena said," Sarah continued, her voice low and steady. "You don't have to look at him. You don't owe him anything. Not your attention, not your fear, not even your hatred." Brianna nodded, drawing strength from the circle of protection her parents and friends had formed around her. 3 months ago, she couldn't have imagined sitting here, pursuing legal action against the man whose approval she'd once desperately sought, the man who had systematically dismantled her confidence, her connections, her sense of self. "All rise." The bailiff's command cut through Brianna's thoughts as the courtroom doors opened. It was time. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly unnatural glow. Judge Miranda Chen, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for fairness and efficiency, presided from the bench, her expression neutral as she reviewed the case file before her. And there, at the respondent's table, sat Richard. Despite her resolve, Brianna's gaze was drawn to him like a magnet. He looked thinner than she remembered, his normally impeccable appearance slightly diminished, his suit still expensive but somehow less crisp, his jawline tighter with tension. When he turned and their eyes met, Brianna felt the familiar pull, that powerful current of complicated emotions that had kept her tethered to him for so long. His expression shifted subtly, softening into the look of wounded confusion he'd perfected over years, the one that had so often made her question her own perceptions, her own memories. "See what you're doing to me?" that look said. Is this really necessary? Diane's hand on her arm broke the connection. Eyes forward. Remember why we're here. The hearing proceeded with a formal rhythm. Statements from attorneys, questions from the judge, evidence presented in the detached language of legal proceedings. Photographs of Brianna's injuries, medical records, text messages that revealed the pattern of control and intimidation beneath Richard's polished exterior. When it was Brianna's turn to testify, she approached the witness stand with legs that felt simultaneously leaden and hollow. The oath was administered, and she sat, adjusting the microphone to her height. "Miss Lewis," Diane began, "could you please describe for the court the events of October 17th of last year?" Brianna took a deep breath and began speaking. Haltingly at first, then with increasing steadiness as she recounted one of many incidents that had left her bruised and frightened. As she spoke, she kept her focus on the far wall of the courtroom, on the American flag hanging limply in its stand, on the grain patterns in the wooden paneling, anywhere but Richard's face. "And was this an isolated incident?" Diane continued after Brianna finished her account. "No," Brianna replied, her voice stronger now. "It happened regularly, at least twice a month for the past 2 years, more frequently in recent months." "And did you seek medical attention for these injuries?" "Sometimes, when I could explain them without raising suspicion. A fall, a kitchen accident, a sports injury." Shame colored her words despite her best efforts. "I became very good at hiding." When Richard's attorney cross-examined her, his approach was surgical, designed not to dispute the abuse itself, but to undermine Brianna's credibility, to suggest instability, to imply she had amplified isolated incidents into a pattern.
"Miss Lewis, isn't it true that you've been treated for anxiety in the past?" "Objection," Diane interjected. "Relevance." "I'll allow it," Judge Chen said, her expression revealing nothing. "But tread carefully, Mr. Owens." "Yes," Brianna answered truthfully. "I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication 3 years ago." "And isn't it possible that this medication, combined with your history of anxiety, might have affected your perception of events in your marriage?" The implication hung in the air that she was unstable, unreliable, prone to exaggeration. It was so similar to what Richard had told her privately for years that Brianna almost instinctively accepted the premise. Almost. "I was prescribed that medication," she said instead, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom, "after Richard pushed me down the stairs in our home and told me I had tripped. After he convinced me that my memory of being pushed was a delusion. The anxiety wasn't the cause of the abuse, Mr. Owens. It was the result." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. From the corner of her eye, Brianna saw her father's shoulders straighten with pride, saw her mother press a tissue to her lips. When it was Richard's turn to testify, he presented himself as the reasonable party, concerned, apologetic for any pain Brianna had experienced, but firmly denying the deliberate nature of her injuries. "Of course we argued like any couple," he said, his voice modulated to convey sincerity and regret. "And yes, there were incidents, times when things got heated, when I may have grabbed her arm too firmly or spoken too harshly." He looked directly at Brianna as he continued. "But I never intentionally hurt my wife. I love her. I've always loved her." The word love in Richard's mouth made Brianna's stomach clench. How skillfully he wielded it, like a shield, like a weapon, like a trap. As the hearing continued, a court officer approached Judge Chen, handing her a note. After reading it, the judge frowned slightly and called both attorneys to the bench for a whispered conference. When they returned to their tables, Diane looked troubled. "What is it?" Brianna whispered. "There's been a development," Diane replied under her breath. "Someone has come forward with information relevant to the case. The judge is calling a 30-minute recess to review it." As Judge Chen announced the recess, confusion rippled through Brianna. What information? What development? Richard appeared equally perplexed, leaning toward his attorney with a questioning expression. In the hallway outside, Diane guided Brianna and her parents to a private conference room. "Someone has submitted evidence to the court," she explained once the door was closed. "A woman named Vanessa Harrington."
The name struck Brianna like a physical blow. Richard's ex-girlfriend from before we met? Diane nodded. "She's here. She's asking to speak with you before she testifies." "Testifies about what?" William asked, his protective instincts visibly rising. "She wouldn't tell me specifically," Diane replied, "only that she has information directly relevant to Brianna's case against Richard. Information she believes Brianna should hear first, privately." Brianna's mind raced. Vanessa Harrington, the woman Richard had dated for nearly 2 years before Brianna, the relationship he rarely discussed except to mention that Vanessa had been emotionally unstable and prone to jealousy. The woman who had seemingly vanished from their social circle shortly after Richard and Brianna began dating. "I need to talk to her," Brianna decided, surprising herself with her certainty. "Are you sure that's wise?" Catherine asked, concern etching her features. "This could be some kind of manipulation." "I don't think so," Brianna replied. "Richard always avoided talking about her, changed the subject whenever she came up." Diane studied Brianna carefully. "If you're certain, I'll arrange it, but I'll be present for the conversation." 10 minutes later, Brianna sat across from a woman she had seen only in a single photograph years earlier. A tall, elegantly composed black woman with close-cropped natural hair and eyes that held a wary intelligence. Vanessa Harrington, now an architect with her own firm in Chicago, according to Diane's brief introduction. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Vanessa began, her voice carrying the slight traces of a Caribbean accent. "I've been following your case since a mutual acquaintance mentioned it to me 2 weeks ago." "Why are you here?" Brianna asked, too emotionally drained for preliminaries. She held her gaze steadily. "Because 7 years ago, I was you." She pushed up the sleeve of her blazer, revealing a small, jagged scar near her wrist. "Different man, same story. I recognized the pattern as soon as I heard about your situation with Richard." Confusion clouded Brianna's thoughts. "Are you saying Richard did this to you?" "No," Vanessa replied. "My ex-fiancé before Richard did, but that's why I initially connected with Richard. We met at a fundraiser for domestic violence survivors. I was newly out of an abusive relationship, vulnerable, still healing, and Richard was understanding, supportive. He seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear." Something cold settled in Brianna's stomach. "I don't understand." "Richard joined that organization's board shortly after his sister was hospitalized by her abusive husband. At least, that's what he told me. He spoke so passionately about stopping the cycle of abuse, about supporting survivors. It was compelling." Brianna's mind reeled. Richard had never mentioned a sister, abused or otherwise. In fact, he had always described himself as an only child raised by a single mother in Connecticut.
"He doesn't have a sister," she said slowly. Vanessa nodded, as if Brianna had confirmed something she already suspected. "I discovered that later, along with other inconsistencies. But by then, our relationship had already changed. He'd already begun testing boundaries, making suggestions about my clothes, my friends, getting angry over small things, then apologizing extravagantly. The description was so familiar, it made Brianna's chest ache. Why didn't you warn me when he started dating me? I tried, Vanessa said simply. I sent you an email about 6 months after you two got together, warning you about what I'd experienced, asking if you were seeing similar signs. Brianna frowned, having no recollection of such a message. I never received any email from you. I know, because Richard responded to it from your account, told me you were happy, that I was bitter and needed to move on, that if I contacted him again, he'd pursue legal action. The revelation hit Brianna like a wave of ice water. Richard had accessed her email, had impersonated her, had deliberately cut off a warning that might have changed everything. But that's not why I'm here today, Vanessa continued, her expression grave. I'm here because what Richard did to both of us was not random, not accidental, not a good man losing control. She leaned forward, her eyes intent. Brianna, I've spent years working with survivor advocacy groups. I've seen hundreds of cases, and what I've learned is that there's a difference between someone who becomes abusive and someone who deliberately targets vulnerable women. What are you saying? Brianna whispered, though part of her already knew. I'm saying Richard Harrington is a predator, one who specifically seeks out women who have already been traumatized, who have survivorship in their history, women he can rescue, then control, women whose previous experiences make them less likely to report new abuse. Brianna's head spun with this new perspective, this reframing of her entire relationship with Richard. How can you know that? Vanessa reached into her briefcase and removed a folder. Inside were printouts of what appeared to be journal entries, dated, methodical notes written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Notes about women, about their vulnerabilities, about strategies for gaining their trust, their dependence. And there, dated 6 years earlier, was Brianna's name. Alongside it, a notation: childhood emotional neglect, father distant, mother overprotective, seeks validation through achievement. Potential.
Diane, who had been silently observing the exchange, leaned forward to examine the documents. These appear to be copied from an original. Do you still have the source material? Vanessa shook her head. I took photos of several pages before I left. I was afraid of what it meant, what he might be capable of. The courtroom doors would reopen in 5 minutes. 5 minutes for Brianna to absorb this revelation, that Richard hadn't simply become abusive over time, that he had selected her, studied her, deliberately exploited vulnerabilities he'd identified from the very beginning. Will you testify to this? Diane asked Vanessa. Yes, she replied without hesitation. And I've brought contact information for 2 other women willing to provide sworn statements about their experiences with Richard. We can establish a pattern of predatory behavior spanning nearly a decade. As the conversation concluded and they prepared to return to the courtroom, Brianna felt something shift inside her, something fundamental in how she understood not just Richard, but herself. The narrative was changing. She wasn't simply a woman who had chosen poorly, who had missed signs, who had allowed abuse to continue. She had been targeted by someone who had made identifying and exploiting vulnerable women into a calculated practice. The realization didn't erase her pain or her shame, but it redistributed the weight of responsibility she had carried for so long. The burden of believing she had somehow invited or deserved what had happened to her. As they walked back toward courtroom C, Brianna caught sight of Richard in the hallway, deep in conversation with his attorney. He glanced up, meeting her eyes with a look of practiced concern, a look she now recognized as entirely manufactured. For the first time, Brianna held his gaze without flinching, without doubt, without the magnetic pull of his influence, And in that moment, something in Richard's expression changed. A flicker of recognition that the woman standing before him was no longer the one he had so carefully manipulated. The woman returning to that courtroom was someone else entirely, someone beginning to understand not just what had been done to her, but why and by whom, someone reclaiming not just her safety, but her narrative. The doors to courtroom C swung open, and Brianna Lewis walked through them with steady steps, ready to hear and tell the truth. Chapter 5: The Pattern. The court finds sufficient evidence to grant a permanent restraining order. Judge Chen's words rang through the courtroom with quiet finality. The ruling came 3 days after Vanessa Harrington's testimony, 3 days of additional witnesses, of evidence review, of Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of the narrative. The respondent, Richard Harrington, is hereby ordered to maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from the petitioner, Brianna Lewis, her residence, her workplace, and her family members as listed in the court documents. This order shall remain in effect for 5 years, at which time the petitioner may apply for renewal if deemed necessary.
Brianna exhaled slowly, the tension of the past weeks partially releasing with her breath. Beside her, Diane squeezed her hand briefly, a small gesture of professional solidarity that meant more than any lengthy congratulations could have. Additionally, Judge Chen continued, her gaze shifting to Richard, who sat rigidly at the respondent's table, the court is referring the evidence presented regarding potential similar conduct with other individuals to the district attorney's office for further investigation. This addition, unexpected but not entirely surprising given Vanessa's testimony and the statements from 2 other women who had come forward, sent a visible ripple of shock through Richard. For the first time since Brianna had known him, he appeared genuinely unprepared, genuinely without a calculated response. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Richard seemed frozen, his carefully constructed facade finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence and consequences. As the proceedings concluded, Brianna moved through the necessary formalities in a state of muted disbelief. It was over, or at least this part was over. The divorce proceedings would continue, but the immediate danger, the fear that had been her constant companion for years, had been legally constrained. Outside the courthouse, spring had begun to softly transform Boston. The harsh edges of winter were receding, with tentative green buds appearing on trees and daffodils pushing through the soil in planters along the sidewalk. Nature's own testimony to the possibility of renewal after dormancy. "You did it," Sarah said, embracing Brianna as they descended the courthouse steps. "I'm so proud of you." "We did it," Brianna corrected, including everyone in her glance, her parents, Elena, Diane, and most surprisingly, Vanessa, who had remained in Boston after her testimony to see the case through. William Lewis, who had maintained a stoic presence throughout the proceedings, finally allowed emotion to show in his weathered face. "I wish," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. Brianna knew what he couldn't say, that he wished he had seen it sooner, that he wished he had asked that pivotal question, "He treats you well, right?" years earlier, that he wished he could erase the pain his daughter had endured. "I know, Dad," she said simply, taking his hand. "But you asked when it mattered, when I was ready to answer." As the group prepared to leave, Alina approached Brianna with her typical directness. "This is a significant victory," she acknowledged, "but I want to make sure you have support for what comes next. The emotional aftermath of these cases can be complex." Brianna nodded, having already experienced the disorienting mixture of relief, grief, anger, and uncertainty that had begun cycling through her even before the final ruling. "I've started seeing a trauma therapist," she confirmed, "twice a week for now." "Good," Elena replied with evident approval. "And the support group?" "I went last Thursday," Brianna admitted. "It was harder than I expected, but also helpful, hearing other women's stories, recognizing pieces of my own experience in theirs. The conversation paused as Vanessa approached, preparing to say her goodbyes before returning to Chicago the following day. "I can never thank you enough," Brianna said, the inadequacy of the words striking her even as she spoke them. Vanessa shook her head. "Don't thank me. This is how we break the pattern, by refusing to stay silent, by warning each other, by making it harder for men like Richard to move undetected from one woman to the next." As the others moved toward the parking area, Vanessa held Brianna back for a moment. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice lower now. "Something I didn't include in my testimony because it wasn't directly relevant to your case." Brianna waited, sensing the seriousness in Vanessa's expression. "After I left Richard, I did some research into his background, trying to make sense of what had happened, I suppose. I discovered he had briefly studied psychology before switching to finance. His undergraduate thesis was on trauma bonding and attachment patterns in abuse survivors." The information settled like a stone in Brianna's stomach. "He studied it academically before he started doing it intentionally?" Vanessa nodded. "I believe so, yes. What happened to you, to us, wasn't just opportunistic abuse. It was engineered." The word hung between them, clinical and chilling. Engineered, designed, implemented with purpose and forethought. "Why are you telling me this now?" Brianna asked. "Because understanding the deliberate nature of what was done to you is part of healing from it, and because I think you're strong enough now to hear it without taking it as a reflection on yourself." Before they parted, Vanessa handed Brianna a business card. "I run a small foundation now, helping women rebuild after relationships like ours. If you ever want to get involved, when you're ready, call me. Your perspective would be valuable." The offer, unexpected but somehow perfectly timed, lodged in Brianna's consciousness as she joined her parents for the drive back to their home where she had been staying since leaving Richard. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just healing, but helping others heal. A possibility to consider when the time was right.
2 weeks after the restraining order was granted, Brianna sat in Dr. Melinda Harper's softly lit office, the now familiar space with its muted colors and comfortable seating, designed to create an environment of safety and openness. "You seem different today," Dr. Harper observed, her keen eyes noting subtle changes in Brianna's posture, her expressions, the way she occupied space in the room. "I found something yesterday," Brianna explained, reaching into her bag and withdrawing a sketchbook, worn at the edges, its cover faded from handling, "when I was packing up the last of my things from my parents' house." With her mother's help, she had been sorting through boxes from her pre-Richard life, belongings that had never made it to the house she shared with him, items that had been stored in her parents' attic during the gradual consolidation of her life into the space Richard controlled. "My old sketchbook," she continued, running her fingers over the cover with a mixture of recognition and unfamiliarity. "From before I met him. From when I was still working as a graphic designer." Dr. Harper leaned forward slightly, her interest evident. "May I ask what's inside?" "Designs, ideas, projects I never started." She opened the book, revealing pages of detailed sketches, logo concepts, typography experiments, illustrated characters, the visual record of a creative mind at work. "I'd forgotten how much I used to draw. How many ideas I had." The discovery had been jarring, like encountering a version of herself she had almost completely forgotten. A version with ambitions, with creative energy, with a future she had envisioned on her own terms before Richard had systematically narrowed her horizons to fit his needs. "And how did it feel to find this?" Dr. Harper asked, her approach gentle but direct, as always. Brianna considered the question. "Sad at first, for all the lost time,
for how completely I set this part of myself aside? She turned another page of the sketchbook, revealing a detailed concept for a children's book she had once planned to illustrate. But then, curious about whether I could still do it, whether that part of me still exists somewhere. And does it? Instead of answering immediately, Brianna turned to the back of the sketchbook, where a new drawing occupied a previously blank page, a self-portrait she had created the previous night, working until nearly dawn with rusty skills but determined focus. The image showed her face divided, half in shadow, half emerging into light. "I think so," she said finally. "Different, maybe, but still there." Dr. Harper studied the drawing with genuine interest. "This is powerful work, Brianna. Have you thought about returning to design professionally?" The question hung in the air, both exciting and intimidating. During her years with Richard, the possibility of resuming her career had become increasingly remote, first discouraged subtly, then forbidden outright as Richard insisted her focus should remain on supporting his professional advancement, on maintaining their home, on being available when and how he needed her.
"I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet," Brianna admitted. "But maybe something smaller to start. A project just for myself." "That sounds like a healthy approach," Dr. Harper affirmed. "Reconnecting with parts of yourself that were suppressed during your marriage is an important aspect of recovery." Recovery. The word itself suggested a destination, a state of being recovered, fully sealed, completely restored. But Brianna was beginning to understand that healing from what she had experienced wasn't a linear journey toward a fixed endpoint. It was messy, circular at times, with progress and setbacks coexisting in the same day, sometimes in the same hour. "I've been thinking about what Vanessa said," Brianna continued, setting the sketchbook aside, "about Richard studying psychology, specifically trauma bonding, about how deliberate it all was." Dr. Harper nodded, encouraging her to continue. "It made me angry at first, furious, actually, that he approached it so clinically, that he saw me as a subject to be manipulated rather than a person to be loved." Brianna's hands tightened briefly in her lap before consciously relaxing. "But it also helped me understand why certain patterns were so hard to break, why I kept going back, kept believing things would change, kept accepting responsibility for his actions. That understanding can be very empowering," Dr. Harper noted. "It shifts the narrative from personal failure to recognition of a deliberately engineered dynamic." "Exactly," Brianna agreed. "It doesn't erase what happened or how I participated in it, but it helps me see it more clearly, and maybe," she hesitated, the thought still forming as she spoke it, "maybe it can help me recognize similar patterns if I encounter them again, not just for myself, but for others." The session continued, touching on practical matters, Brianna's ongoing divorce proceedings, her gradual steps toward financial independence, and her tentative plans to eventually find her own apartment rather than remaining indefinitely with her parents. Throughout the conversation, a new quality emerged in her speech, her thinking, a tentative but growing clarity, a sense of agency that had been absent in earlier sessions. As their time drew to a close, Dr. Harper posed one final question. "What's one thing you're looking forward to this week, Brianna? Something specific, something tangible." The query was part of their regular routine, an exercise in redirecting focus toward future possibilities rather than past traumas. Usually, Brianna had to search for an answer, her horizons still habitually narrowed by years of conditioning. This time, however, she responded without hesitation. "I'm meeting with a small publishing house on Thursday about possibly illustrating a children's book about emotions and mental health for young readers." She smiled slightly, the expression still somewhat unfamiliar on her face. "The connection came through Elena, actually. The author is a former client of hers." "That sounds like a meaningful project," Dr. Harper observed.
one that combines your creative skills with the insights you've gained through your own experiences.
Brianna nodded, a quiet determination settling into her features. That's what I thought too. Using what happened not just to heal myself, but maybe to help others, especially children, understand and express their emotional experiences more clearly, to recognize what's healthy and what isn't from the beginning. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, Brianna caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror near Dr. Harper's office door, a reflection that seemed more substantial somehow than it had been weeks earlier. Not fully healed, not completely recovered, but gradually reclaiming definition, edges, boundaries, presence. Outside, spring had progressed during her session, the afternoon sun warming the air and illuminating the emerging greenery along the sidewalk. Brianna paused for a moment, tilting her face upward to absorb the light, the heat, the sense of possibility that seemed to radiate from the changing season. Her phone chimed with a text message, Sarah confirming their plans to visit a gallery opening that evening. Another small step, another reclamation of interests and connections that had been systematically eliminated during her years with Richard. As Brianna typed her reply, she noticed a figure across the street, a man whose height and build momentarily reminded her of Richard. Her breath caught, her pulse quickening automatically before her rational mind registered that it was a stranger, merely someone of similar physical appearance. The moment of fear passed, but it left a sobering reminder. Recovery wasn't linear. The patterns Richard had etched into her nervous system wouldn't disappear overnight, or perhaps ever entirely. The hypervigilance, the instinctive physical responses to perceived threats, these might remain as scars, as evidence of what she had survived. But survival itself was no small achievement, and what came after survival, the rebuilding, the reclaiming, the reimagining of what life could be, that was the chapter Brianna was beginning to write now, with her own hand, in her own voice, at her own pace. As Brianna continued down the sidewalk toward the T station, Brianna felt a subtle shift in her perception, a widening of focus beyond the immediate path before her to the broader landscape of possibility that surrounded it. The city seemed more accessible somehow, more navigable, less filled with potential threats and more with potential discoveries. One step at a time, she reminded herself, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And today, in this moment, she was choosing to move forward, not because she had completely healed, not because she had all the answers, but because movement itself was an act of defiance against everything Richard had tried to instill in her, everything he had tried to make her believe about her capabilities, her worth, her right to exist independently of his definitions and demands. This simple act of walking freely through the city, of having destinations and purposes of her own choosing, was revolution in its quietest, most personal form. A revolution Richard would never witness, would never fully comprehend, but one that would ultimately render his influence powerless. Step by step, day by day, choice by choice, Brianna Lewis was reclaiming her life, not the life she had before Richard, but something new, something shaped by what she had endured, but not defined by it, something that remained unfinished, evolving, open to possibilities she had not yet imagined. And perhaps that openness, that unfinished quality, was the point. Perhaps the greatest victory over Richard's rigid control was not arriving at some perfect state of healing, but embracing the messy, imperfect, ongoing process of becoming who she chose to be rather than who anyone else had tried to make her. As Brianna descended the stairs to the subway platform, she carried this understanding with her, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. The story wasn't over. It was, in many ways, just starting to unfold. Chapter 6, Full Circle. 1 year later. The gallery space on Newberry Street hummed with conversation and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Summer evening light streamed through the tall windows, casting long, golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor. Brianna Lewis stood in the center of it all, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, watching as strangers moved from piece to piece, studying her work with expressions ranging from casual interest to intense contemplation. Her first solo exhibition, 24 pieces that chronicled a journey, not just her own, but a universal passage from darkness to light, from confinement to freedom, from silence to voice. "They're responding to it," Sarah whispered, appearing at Brianna's side with barely contained excitement. "That woman over there has been staring at Threshold for like 10 minutes straight." Brianna followed her friend's gaze to where an elegant older woman stood transfixed before one of the largest pieces in the collection, a mixed media work depicting a doorway, half in shadow, half illuminated, with a figure poised precisely at the division between the two states. "Should I go talk to her?" Brianna asked, still unaccustomed to her role as featured artist, as creator whose perspective was now actively sought rather than systematically diminished. "Absolutely," Sarah encouraged. "She looks like she has questions." As Brianna crossed the room, she caught glimpses of herself in the gallery's scattered mirrors. A woman of 32 now, dressed in a simple linen dress of her own choosing, her hair cut to a length that felt right to her rather than pleasing to someone else's aesthetic. A woman who moved with purpose, who occupied space unapologetically, who had rediscovered her voice in both literal and metaphorical terms. "Hello," she said as she approached the woman studying her work. "I'm Brianna Lewis, the artist. I noticed you've been spending some time with this piece." The woman turned, her eyes widening slightly with recognition. "Miss Lewis, yes, I find it deeply affecting." She extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Chen, Judge Miranda Chen's mother, actually." The connection registered immediately. Judge Chen, who had granted Brianna's permanent restraining order against Richard, who had referred his case to the district attorney's office, who had, in her official capacity, helped create the legal space in which Brianna could begin to heal.
"It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Chen," Brianna said with genuine warmth. "Your daughter played a significant role in my life at a critical moment." Understanding passed between the two women, the kind that required no elaboration, that acknowledged depths without needing to plumb them in casual conversation. This story speaks to the journey of countless women who have found themselves trapped in the invisible chains of abuse, and to the possibility of freedom that begins with a single moment of truth. If you or someone you know is struggling with domestic violence, remember that no one deserves to walk this path alone. By subscribing to our channel, you help us continue sharing stories that illuminate the darkness and provide hope to those who need it most. Your support creates a community where silence is broken, where healing becomes possible, and where each person's journey toward reclaiming their life is witnessed and honored. Subscribe now to join us in this vital conversation, because every story of survival deserves to be told, and every step toward freedom deserves to be celebrated.